So while I was making Why No One Plays Yoymia, I began to notice a recurring issue among the characters that don't do very well popularity-wise, especially 5-star ones, and that led me to wanting to work on a standalone episode to point out that recurring issue. If there's one thing about Genshin that I think all of us can agree with, it's that there's massive potential within this game. Even after our expectations have gone down, I think this game has the potential to be one of the best designed, at least in the gacha scene. The world building, the mechanics, the gameplay, the exploration, so much to tap into. While most of them boil down to simple puzzles and fetch quests, the events they made for areas like the Golden Apple Archipelago to Labyrinth Warriors and Enkanomiya showed that they could design just about anything and it would be really engaging for the players. The foundation for this game is leagues more extensive than any gacha title I've seen so far, yet frustratingly, the amount of detail and time they put into those events are for the most part endemic to just ephemeral content, not reflected in the base game, what is available to us year-round. Quite the opposite, the base game leaves much to be desired. If you were to remove the events, the quality of experience decreases significantly, and one such aspect of that lowered value stems from the very means to partake in that content, the characters. Hoyoverse is very inconsistent when it comes to character designs, gameplay-wise at least. On occasion, they might break out a well-rounded character, one who has a definitive function and an intuitive playstyle that's conducive to it, but that isn't present for every character. Several units in the roster feel like they have something missing within their kit, that if it were present, it could improve their usability without necessarily inflating their strength. Today, we're going to discuss the existence of incomplete characters. I say incomplete in air quotes because I'm not saying their current version is bad or unplayable, rather something in their design lacks cohesion or is either counterintuitive or counterproductive. Gacha games across all subgenres have only one goal in mind, to sell you as many units, characters, or weapons as humanly possible. If you've been in the scene for a while and have played all sorts of different games, it's very common for these types of games to focus on quantity over quality. I used to play Final Fantasy Brave Exvius religiously. I was super hardcore at that game, but eventually I quit after realizing every week there would be a new banner with OP characters that you had to pull for just to clear this one single event, and it got to a point where this week's best would be next week's mediocre. When I switched to Genshin, naturally the slower release frequency took some getting used to. I went from seeing 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 new units a month to 2, maybe only 1. Granted, Genshin's rates are far less generous than FFBE's, and their free mode gems are also few and far between. But it's balanced out by the fact that characters don't come out as often. See, what's interesting about this game that makes it unique, among many other things, is the amount of exposure each individual unit gets. From the legendary archons to the side characters, Hoyoverse makes a concerted effort to incorporate them into the universe, giving them entire designs, voice acting, backgrounds, unique abilities, animations, showcases, and more importantly, involvement in the world. The scope of influence they have might be on the lower side, but it's meaningful enough to where you would remember them and the connections they have with the overarching lore. More importantly, it leaves the door open for future possible involvement as it effectively cements their existence as canon, not filler one-off characters. If they're not present within the Archon questline, a separate story is made specifically for them, one that, while technically relevant to the traveler's own goals, helps us understand the world of Teyvat and its inhabitants. Whatever the scenario, these characters not only share a bond with Aether and Lumine, but with their peers, and you get to see them understand each other in different lights. Further than that, personal story quests and hangout events allow you to establish intimate ties with every character. Like many others, I do wish I got to see them more frequently wandering around Mondstadt, Liyue, and Inazuma rather than only appearing during cutscenes and quests, but at the very least, they're memorable cast members. The sheer amount of effort Genshin's developers put in for each of their characters is what makes this game so rich in substance. It's been over a year, and I still fondly remember Razor foreshadowing Klee's innocently destructive natures by calling her Red Bernie Girl, or when you went on a date with Lisa to collect overdue books. Each character feels real. They don't feel like summoned otherworldly characters or mindless soldiers like in other gacha titles. You need look no further than the fan bases of each one. There are people who swear by characters just because of their character appeal, no matter how bad their gameplay might be. And it's the main reason Aloy's inclusion was met with so much controversy. She's a summoned otherworldly character, which would have normally been fine if this were any other universe. But this is Genshin Impact, they don't do things the same way. To many of us, Aloy has no presence because she doesn't belong in the Genshin universe. She belongs in the Horizon universe. Therein lies the problem though. I say this in almost all my videos, but there are two things that are necessary for a character's success in this game: appeal and gameplay. Almost everyone gets a 10 out of 10 in terms of appeal. I don't think there's a single forgettable person in this game. It's gameplay where not all units were created equal. I'm not exclusively talking about their efficiency in combat or their corresponding elements. I'm mostly referring to how the characters are supposed to be played. It's definitely important to have the benefit of likability on your side, but that alone does not make for a worthwhile character. Where this anime, then I mean that's all they need. Video games, however, ultimately judge playable entities by that very criteria, playability. If the character feels bad to play or has something in their kit that disrupts the natural flow of combat, it damages their popularity far greater than lack of personality. Putting it simply, you need to have both appeal and good gameplay to have a truly successful character. But if you could choose only one, 90% of video gamers will always choose good gameplay since that's what they'll be tapping into at the end of the day. You can think of it like baking a cake. The gameplay is the batter, the appeal is the decorations, topping, icing, what have you. Obviously, not many people want to eat a cake with no toppings, but I mean personally speaking, I find the cake itself the most important part. All the toppings and decorations in the world can't make up for bad cake batter. Two examples of this would be the tiny 5-stars, Klee and Chichi. Both of them are as cinnamon roll as they come, and extremely popular ones among the fanbase, but they're two of the least used 5-stars in the game because both of them have very egregious issues in their gameplay. Prevailing Wisdom is aware of Klee's frustrating usability problems. Catalysts in general have a lot that needs to be fixed, so I won't attribute this to only her, but her combination of clunky attack animations, inconsistent targeting, and poor range hinder her ability to be used effectively, something the demos and showcases didn't mention at all. She has several aspects to her kit that would make her very powerful as a sub-DPS, such as Sparks and Splash behaving much like Xingqiu's Rain Cutter, and Jumpty Dumpty leaving behind persistent mines and reducing defense. There was a perfect opportunity to make her a Pyro Reactor, but instead they chose to lock her into being a main damage dealer. Chichi is one of, if not the best dedicated healer in the game if we go by pure regenerative capability, but her kit is entirely devoid of ways to sustain her uptime, namely in that she, a support unit, has no semblance of energy charge. Moreover, her healing components are not immediate, nor do they originate from her the way they do on Kokomi or Barbara. She has to first place the talisman on her target, then switch to the wounded ally to attack that talisman for health, which is sort of counterintuitive to what a healer does, reduce the risk of danger and exposure for the main DPS. At this point, I'm anticipating some of you might ask why do they have to do things in the way I described them to? Like who decides that Klee should be a sub-DPS and not a main one, or who am I to say that Chichi's healing is the wrong way to heal? To clear that up, let me head on over to the other side of the spectrum and talk about examples of complete characters. So Kazuha is a support unit. What are the required duties of that type of character? First, Animo itself is known for coverage, crowd control, and mobility. Kazuha passes all three with flying colors thanks to his skill and burst. Second, supports are designed to increase the combat efficiency of their party through one of 4 ways: reducing party downtime, amplifying party damage, decreasing enemy resistance, or increasing enemy vulnerability. Kazuha performs as easily as well. His elemental skill corrals enemies together, which increases their vulnerability and lowers the time your DPS has to spend attacking each one at a time. His elemental burst raises your damage output, and if paired up with 4-piece Resistant Venerer, decreases enemy resistance. He does everything expected from an Animo support unit. By extension, Sucrose and Venti do this as well, hence why all three are widely used. Ganyu is a cryo damage dealer. What is expected from a damage dealer? High damage, coverage, and minimal uptime. Additionally, her cryo element grants her the ability to abuse Frozen, which she does very well thanks to set uptime. Ayaka has the exact same thing. She's one of the most consistent DPS units in the game and inflicts outstanding damage on both isolated opponents and clusters of enemies. Her normal and burst rotation don't conflict with one another. Thanks to both Ayaka and Ganyu's burst remaining on the field after swapping out, they can still contribute while you're cycling through your supports. Essentially, for a character to be complete, they need to be intuitive and perform the tasks mandated by their role. The more bases they cover and the more efficiently they do so, the better they are. We can compare Ganyu and Yoymia together. Pyro and Cryo are both very strong elements, so neither can be used as leverage against the other. Now to reiterate, what is expected from a main DPS unit? Damage, coverage, uptime, and consistency as per the standards conceptualized by the game's mechanics. To start, Yoimiya's coverage is virtually non-existent. She's entirely single target, which permanently bottlenecks her potential output, as hypothetically, she would have to dish out 5 times more damage than Ganyu on one single target to compete with Ganyu's ability to strike 5 targets simultaneously, if that makes sense. As for consistency, look no further than her burst. The Aura's blaze cannot be triggered by Yoimiya herself, it needs another party member to do so, but assuming her party consists of 1 DPS and 3 supports, she would have to compromise in the uptime department to make use of it, and so most Yoimiya players choose not to. If you're still confused as to what separates the two, let's head on over to Super Smash Bros. There are 2 fighters that are essentially identical to each other, Marth and Lucina. They have the same attacks, frame data, attributes, etc., with the only difference between the two being that Marth has 2 hitboxes on his attacks, a sweet spot located at the tip of his sword and a sour spot everywhere else. When landing that sweet spot, Marth's attacks vastly overshadow Lucina's in kill power, but the sour spots are extremely weak. If you average the kill percentage of Marth based on these 2 clips, it rounds out at about 93.5% versus Lucina's 97%. But in a game so heavily predicated on high-octane twitch inputs and spacing, coupled by the fact that Marth's tipper hitbox encompasses only about a quarter of his total hitbox size, the payoff is not worth it most of the time, thus resulting in Marth being rated far lower in performance than Lucina. In his defense, that's more of a skill issue than anything else. So in that case, there's another example in the form of Incineroar, whose combination of attacks, range, frame data, and explosive kill power make for a very terrifying adversary if it wasn't for the fact that he has the worst movement physics of anyone else in the game. There's also a running joke that Kirby would be significantly stronger if he had the airspeed of his fellow puffball Jigglypuff, the latter being famous for aerial mobility. Going back to Genshin, a lot of units with poor popularity have very good theoretical applications like once again Klee. She has a lot of good stuff in her kit. Constellation 2 breaks enemy defense by 23% for 10 seconds with Jumpty Dumpty, and Sparks and Splash would be phenomenal to have on Hydro or Cryo units. Imagine if this was on Child, Ayata or Ayaka. Vaporize and melt like you would never believe. I mean, just think about it. Shogun, Shincho, and Klee packed into a main DPS. The problem is, many of these units carry valuable skills and attacks, but the restrictions placed on them prevent those talents from being used to their fullest extent, leaving many players unsatisfied with the unit as a whole. Kokomi is supposed to be a battle healer, but she can't crit, the single most important stat for damage. Yoymia is supposed to be a ranged pyro damage dealer, but she lacks area coverage and burst, two things pyro units are well known for. Xinyan is a physical damage dealer with conflicting scaling, and of course, she's not a cryo or electro unit, so superconduct is harder to achieve on her. From what I've heard, Yayamiko's design has a lot of holes in it that prevent her from being a well-rounded unit too. With that said, I'm not insinuating that every character needs to cover every single base. Not every damage support needs to be like Kazuha, not every healer needs to be like Kokomi. But it's important to distinguish between a character who's overpowered and a character with a well-rounded playstyle. Case in point, Diluc. He's still widely used despite being one of the original 5. In fact, of the original 5, I'd say he withstood the test of time the best. Sure, he's most definitely gotten power crept out of the meta, but if we go back to the criteria you have to meet for damage, he's got damage, insane coverage, very consistent, there's nothing in his kit that can miss timing or miss entirely, and his uptime is pretty respectable if you space out your attacks. The only thing barring him from the top spot is that his numbers are not as overinflated, but he's still a fantastic character to use because he feels so intuitive to play. Stuff like this is evidence of lack of proper testing. Part of me believes the reason Ayaka and Xiao are two of their best designed characters is due in part to them being around since beta, so they've been in development for years, and also players were able to test them out. Same goes for every incomplete character. If they spent a little more time stress testing or edge casing a new character to see what sort of combinations they'd be ideal in or the true limits of their abilities, Hoyoverse can locate these types of issues almost immediately. The only defense I can think of for developers to deliberately cripple these units is that they're afraid of creating another Bennett, Xingqiu, or Zhongli, and to be fair, I don't blame them, but that's all the more reason you gotta test these characters out. Hire a bunch of playtesters or make a testing server. There are hundreds of thousands of players who would love to volunteer to test new characters at no expense. I mean, they're doing it with or without your consent anyway, what with the data miners and leaks. Even then, with 7 different elements and multiple different weapon types, there's nothing wrong with having a lot of very powerful characters. Ayaka and Ganyu are both cryo damage dealers, but since they have very different playstyles and properties, they're both able to sit at the top and enjoy equal popularity. The same for Venti and Kazuha, they have slightly different niches. Spiral Abyss requires you to make 2 different parties as well, so there are situations where having several top tier characters with similar functions is actually a good thing. And even if that weren't the case, it presents you with options. The more equal characters are, the better it is to the game's overall health because players can decide what they want to choose from and not have to focus on just 1 or 2 that are at the top. Inevitably, there will be some who are better than others, but the goal of game design is to narrow that gap as much as humanly possible so that we don't have one class of units who are always used and another who are never used. What do you guys think about incomplete characters? Do you agree or disagree with my points on them? And for those who disagree, feel free to share down in the comments below why you think that way. If you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate it if you left a like and subscribe. Consider following me on Twitter, joining my Discord server, and if you still have time, why not check out my video on New Player Lockout after this one. For now though, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon in the next one. Take care.